These results, with the first of two measures of moral identity, indicated that the higher participants were in psychopathy, the less they internalized and symbolized moral traits. This suggests a general distancing from moral traits in psychopathy, and that moral attributes might be generally less important to the self-concepts of people who rank higher in psychopathy. Their second moral identity measure was useful to test this possibility about importance, the adapted good self assessment. When the authors analyzed the results of the good self assessment, they found that the more people selected moral traits as very important to them, the less psychopathic they were. So this is that first negative correlation there in the box, top left. This was driven entirely by a link between the lower importance of moral traits and the interpersonal affective dimension of psychopathy, that callousness, manipulativeness, lack of guilt and remorse. These qualities were associated with being less likely to consider the moral traits as important to the self. Interestingly, the less people selected those pragmatic traits as important to them, the higher they ranked in the lifestyle antisocial psychopathy factor. There was no association between that factor and the importance of moral traits. Why might this be? The positive pragmatic traits, such as being industrious and logical, might be protective against the lifestyle antisocial factor of psychopathy and its qualities of impulsivity and irresponsibility. The positive correlation between pragmatic traits and the interpersonal affective factor, on the other hand, suggests that some people high in psychopathy featuring the interpersonal affective factor may value these non-moral pragmatic traits over and above moral traits. So, are psychopathic traits related to moral identity? Yes, using a scale measure of moral identity, Glenn and colleagues showed us that the higher participants were in psychopathy, the less they internalized and symbolized moral traits. This suggested that moral attributes are generally less important to the self-concepts of people who rank higher in psychopathy. Testing this with the adapted good self-assessment showed that indeed, the higher people were in interpersonal affective factor of psychopathy, the less important they deemed moral traits. They actually considered pragmatic traits slightly more important. The researchers wanted to know, do these results reflect differences in moral reasoning between participants? Do psychopaths actually employ different methods to reconcile these moral dilemmas when in their thinking? Or are the patterns we just saw, where people higher in psychopathy assign totally different importance to moral traits, just separable from moral behavior and moral decision making? To understand this, they introduced a measure of moral judgment, a thought experiment type moral dilemma. In this moral dilemma, the scenario is that enemy soldiers have taken over your village. They have orders to kill all remaining civilians over the age of 2. You and some of your townspeople have sought refuge in 2 rooms of the cellar of a large house. Outside, you hear the voices of soldiers who have come to search the house for valuables. One condition involved personal harm. The resolution to that scenario was your baby, who is with you in the room, begins to cry loudly. You put your hand over his mouth to block the sound. If you remove your hand from his mouth, his crying will summon the attention of the soldiers, who will spare your baby's life but will kill you and the others hiding in both rooms. To save yourself and the others, you must keep your hand on his mouth and smother your baby to death. Is it appropriate for you to smother your baby in order to save yourself and the other townspeople? Yes or no? And the other condition involved impersonal harm. In this condition, your baby begins to cry loudly in the other room. His crying will summon the attention of the soldiers, who will spare your baby's life, but will kill you and the others hiding in both rooms. If you turn on the noisy furnace to block the sound, the other room will become uncomfortably hot for the adults and children, but deadly for infants. To save yourself and the others, you must activate the furnace, which will kill your baby. Is it appropriate for you to overheat your baby in order to save yourself and the other townspeople? Yes or no? Results showed that psychopaths were more willing to employ harm in both cases, the personal harm condition and the impersonal harm condition. Their moral judgment score did not predict their moral identity scores, however. That is, their selections for these dilemmas were not consequential when it came to understanding moral identity. The researchers conclude the relationship between moral identity and psychopathy was found to be stronger than the relationship between moral judgment and psychopathy. This is somewhat surprising. It suggests how we think about moral conundrums might matter less to psychopathy than how we think about ourselves as having moral traits. Furthermore, this suggests that, as the authors note, moral identity may be an important factor to examine in future research on why psychopathic individuals behave immorally. And this is an interesting burgeoning area with the potential to take psychology and philosophy into the world, to make a positive impact, reduce violence, and promote prison reform. Here's a break for a question. People high in psychopathy have different moral psychology features compared to people low in psychopathy. Which of the following characterizes the moral psychology of psychopathy? 1. Psychopathy is associated with reduced identification with moral traits, but this is independent from moral decision making. 2. Psychopathy is associated with reduced identification with moral traits and with moral decision making that reflects greater willingness to commit personal harm compared to impersonal harm. 3. Psychopathy is associated with inflated moral identity, which is independent from moral decision making. Or 4. Psychopathy is associated with a greater propensity to commit personal and impersonal harm and a view of the self as extremely moral.